Hey everyone, it's Helen from S&B Deal Hunter. Today we have Kaustubh Deo with us. Kaustubh acquired a tree care business in Seattle in 2022 after working in private equity and also did two add-on acquisitions last year. Really looking forward to hearing Kaustubh's story. Kaustubh, it's great to have you on today.
Awesome. Thanks for having me on.
Tell us a little bit about your background first. How did you're working in private equity? What made you decide to leave that world and get into small
Yeah.
business acquisitions?
Well, I really love how like understanding how things work and how businesses work. That's why I got like when I was in college and realized you could get paid for just like asking companies about themselves and like asking, C-suite about themselves. I was like, wow, that's really sick. So that's why I went into finance and investing in the first place. And I basically hit this wall where it was a both like personally, I don't think I could have just sustained what, private equity requires of you, like the kind of
What does it require of you? Tell us for those who don't work in
yeah.
private equity. Tell us what that looks like.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like it's a certain level of prioritization where like work really comes before all else, and it's like it's hours obviously, but it's also just like it's all you're kind of on call always, right? Like that you can't ever turn it off. Like I've been the guy like literally in Aruba on the beach with my laptop and Wi-Fi hotspot, like working on slides, right? Like which like if you love the game, like it's great and it's like people are really good at it. The people I worked for were really good at it. Like I totally get why LPs gave us money to invest. It just like I just knew like I wasn't gonna be able to sustain that. I wanted to build something a little bit more balanced for my like life with other elements of life. Um, and so I thought like, hey, like if I'm gonna grind at something for like 5 to 10 years, I'd like it to be something where I really build a lot of equity value and kind of get to more than equity value, like structure my time a little bit more and like own my time a little bit more. So that's sort of the kind of what was driving me towards small business and search.
And what made you kind of pull the trigger finally? You're probably thinking about it for a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I looked at listings for a few months and I was like, okay, I think I can kind of do this. And then I was getting my promotion to the role where you start first get carry in the fund, right? Like kind of a version of equity, basically. And like that's really the moment where like golden handcuffs go on,
Yeah.
right? And so I had this feeling of like, I'm not married yet, I don't have kids yet. Like if I'm ever gonna take a risk, like now is the time, right? The risk actually gets harder to take over time. So when I pulled the plug on PE, I was like 27 and I closed the deal at 28. So I was still relatively young, but I think that like it just allowed me to be more risk on.
Yeah, that makes sense. Wow, good for you. What did the search look like? How long did it take you? Where were you looking? Was it
Yeah. I
on
looked
market,
more
off market?
casually. Yeah, I looked more casually for several months before I made the hard decision, like that I'm doing this. Um, and so then once I told the firm, hey, I'm actually going to leave and do this, I kept working at the PE firm, working on just one deal for them, running a sale process, which they were really gracious in letting me do because that meant I still had an income. But basically, I only did brokered search. I only looked at listings. I initially started looking nationally, but then as I kind of kept working on it, I realized part of the benefit of self-funded search is you can own it for a long time, right? So I didn't want to cut off that potential outcome. So I started looking only in Seattle and the Bay Area because those were cities that I could imagine living in a long time. And I'm from Seattle, I should say. And so ultimately, I got to know the brokers in Seattle a little bit more. And like once you start looking in your own hometown, like deals just feel more doable. Like I know the neighborhoods, I know what's going on. That's what happened is I closed a business in Seattle proper.
Got it. No, that makes a lot of sense. When you were looking and what was your buy box like initially or your thesis, your investment thesis initially, and how did
Yeah.
that, I mean, you mentioned kind of looking nationwide to pivoting into just looking into pretty major cities, I guess, but what
Yeah.
else kind of changed or what were you initially looking for?
Yeah, I mean, the way I thought about it at the time is like you need some kind of an edge as a searcher, right? Like some kind of angle. And I didn't have a capital edge, right? Like I'm not like a funded PE firm or like I don't have a ton of money to just put in. I needed an SBA loan, I needed investor capital. I didn't have like any given industry experience. Like I didn't have like an industry edge. So the one edge I felt like I did have, oh, and I was going to focus on the location. So I didn't have like a geographic edge, right? And so like the one edge I thought I had is like I can do diligence really fast, right? Like I can learn and understand if an industry is a good industry really fast. And so what I did is I kept my industry filter wide open, right? Because I kind of had a good handle on like what are the characteristics of a good business in a good industry, and I could diligence that. So like I was focused on revenue quality, obviously, like everyone. I was owner dependence was the one that I was willing to compromise the most on, which is what I did. And I think like customer concentration is what I was least willing to compromise on because it's just like so much binary risk in a pretty levered deal.
It makes total sense. And what were some of the opportunities you looked at?
Yeah, I got really serious about a tourism business in Alaska, actually, which would have been really cool. It was like
That would
a
have been sick.
That would have been so sick. It was seasonal. It was like only between like Memorial Day and Labor Day. And it was like basically bus tours. Like the company owned the buses and they had tour guides. And so people would fly in and they would organize this like 8 to 14 day bus tour. But then all the actual activities like kayaking or glacier walk or helicopter, whatever, like that's all subcontracted, right, to the activity providers. And so it was really a really good sales and marketing and kind of like a project management business. It only had like 3 full-time employees, and then it had, it's like crew of seasonal crew tour guides that were mostly like school teachers because those are actually really good as like tour
Yeah.
guides. So that business looked really good, but the seller kind of got cold feet at the end and pulled the plug, which was a bummer. Um, and I looked at another one that was more of like a technology reseller, which actually another searcher ended up buying in Seattle. And that one I liked it. It was tough for me because coming in as like a 28-year-old, like that business sold into regional grocery chains. And so it's just like from a who is my client, like are they going to respect me as like the face of the sales organization? Like it just didn't feel like a good fit. Whereas like with home service, it's like homeowners, we have no customer concentration, like our arborists are the sales folk, like not me. And so it just felt like a much more natural like searcher business fit.
That makes sense. Tell us more about the tree care business you ended up acquiring.
Yeah, I mean, so I saw a couple different tree care businesses come for sale as I was searching, so I got to learn a little bit about it. And the big learning for me was like tree removal is one-time revenue because once you remove the tree, it's gone, right? Whereas tree pruning and tree trimming is repeat revenue. And so it's just significantly higher quality. And so this business that I looked at, like the owner had done a really good job of building this big client base of pruning clients. So, we're like 75% of revenue is tree pruning, not removal. And so that's what really got me comfortable with like, okay, like, yes, every job is a one-off project, but the client base is constantly repeating. And it's not even like concentrated where it's like general contractors who keep building stuff. No, it's actually like individual homeowners, right? And even when the homeowners like change hands, like they tell the new homeowner, like, hey, here's our tree guy. Um,
We just did that, so I
yeah,
totally
exactly. So
makes
that's
total sense.
yeah, and it's the kind of contractor that like anyone who doesn't own a home, they're kind of like, oh, tree services, what is that? And then everyone I know who owns a home are like, oh, I get it. Like it's an important like, what's nice is like as soon as people have actually decided that they're gonna call it tree service, they already know they're paying a higher price point. Their landscaper can't do it or doesn't want to do it. So like we're able to charge more of a premium price, which means I can build culture, I can build, actual like employee satisfaction. We can really train people. Like we have certified arborists across like, like we have 8 certified arborists now. So like that part I really liked about the industry that it's a little bit more passion driven and a little bit more kind of technical skill. It's a real skilled trade.
It's interesting. You mentioned the high repeat. It's, I'm guessing, reoccurring.
Yeah.
What kind of ticket size are we talking about? Like, how often are these? I guess mostly residential. How often
Yeah.
are these folks coming back and leveraging your guys' services generally, or just across the industry?
Yeah, it depends on the type of trees, but any like so like fruit trees and hedges are like annually basically, whereas like the larger like mature conifers in the like we have in the Northwest, that could be every like 3 to 10 years, depending on what work needs to be done. And then the average project size for us is about $2,000 to $3,000.
Got it. How big was the deal, and how did you structure it?
Yeah, so at the time, the business had around 8 employees and the 2 owners. And at that time, it was like a little under 2 million in revenue. And it was a pretty classic self-funded search deal, right? Like some seller note, SBA loan, and then the down payment portion was like I'm the majority owner, but I took investor capital that, came in as a pref and all of that.
Tell us about that a little, because I think obviously two of us both back a lot of these folks,
Yeah.
but I think a lot of people still aren't super familiar with terms on a self-funded search
Yeah,
deal if they need help raising capital from investors. So walk us
totally.
through like how you structured it. Was it pretty typical, or like what did you do there?
Yeah. So the really basic structure, which mine is roughly this, it's like some percentage points off, but basically 80% of the total deal is funded by SBA loan. 10% of the total deal is by a seller note that ensures they have some skin in the game. And then there's a 10% equity down payment. And then in my deal, of that 10%, I think I put in something like 20 to 25, I forget exactly, percent of the actual cash. But the way these deals work is like the investors put in the rest, but then their money goes in as what's called preferred equity, which has an accrual rate on it of like somewhere between 8 to 12%. Um, so once that's paid back, then you as a searcher, you have a majority of the common equity behind that. And so for me, that's where I have the majority. And that to me was an interesting part of self-funded search, right? Whereas traditional search, generally the searcher ends up with the like 25-ish% of the equity. So having control and having majority equity was important to me. So that's how this is structured.
And you also took a salary, I'm guessing, in
Yes,
that
yeah,
deal.
yeah. So we have a predetermined salary that like I can't raise that without investor approval, basically. I think we have a fixed like 5% escalator, but that's it. Yeah.
Got it. And how did you find these investors?
This was sort of the networking and kind of, so about half of them are from my former career, right? Either former colleagues or a couple of my bosses from both firms that I worked for. But then I also wanted to have folks on the cap table that are small business owners themselves and can kind of provide that mentorship side. And so for me, it was like a mix of I got involved in the sort of SMB Twitter world. I got involved writing in like my own Substack and blog about this, and this is how I met a lot of folks. And so yeah, it was sort of like just old school, meet people one at a time, and then find folks that are really aligned with me.
And when did you start that process? Was it, during the search, or was it really when you had a deal on hand that you could,
No,
talk to
no, it was
these folks
well
about?
before. Yeah, yeah. It was definitely during the search. I mean, even now as an investor at search deals, like I rarely look at deals when I just like the first contact is I get to see a teaser, right?
Yeah.
For me, it's much more like I like to see the searcher go through the search process, see what deals they're passing on, why, because then you start to actually understand, okay, like once they bring you a deal that they're excited about, like why are they excited? Like what is their searcher fit to the business? So I would send out sort of like quarterly updates kind of to like the folks who were interested in my search. And then separately, I was running my whole Substack, which also was sort of like a little bit more top of funnel in terms of like how my search was going. And that had a much wider readership base. So between those two, I was able to kind of build out an investor group.
That's great. How many investors did you end up how big was that investor group?
Yeah, it ended up being around 10 people, which is like probably a few more than we like. It was a little bit more complex. It was one of those strange things though, where you don't know exactly which investors are going to be really helpful, and you kind of know everyone reasonably well, but you've never done a deal with them. So it ended up being right. Like it was a good mix of folks, and different people have different skills they bring to the table. But it is a little bit of like you have to do some herding of like getting documents in and sending out K1s and all of that. But it's been roughly 10 people.
I guess I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but how are you kind of managing investor relations, post acquisition?
Yeah, I mean, the first year I sent out monthly updates, like financial updates and kind of some qualitative, thoughts. Since then, I've sort of that's petered back down to like quarterly or even like semi-annually, primarily because I just haven't had the time, frankly. And the investors, like at this point, we've built trust, right? And they know I'm, doing what's best for the business. But at a minimum, I send an annual letter each year. I send some kind of a like, hey, here's the budget for the year. And then some sort of like, this is the end of the year, update. And then something in the middle of the year to talk about like what is progress and how is it looking.
Got it. I guess just going back to, maybe during the diligence phase, since, you mentioned your sort of secret sauce or your superpower is really being able to diligence deals quickly.
Yeah.
What did you specifically dig into with the tree care service?
Yeah, I mean, with any small business and tree care included, like the number one diligence thing for me is understanding how the business makes money, right? And so it's really operationally saying from point A to point Z, how does your business like generate revenue and profit, right? Like, and it sounds so obvious, but it's really like, okay, like when somebody puts in a contact form on the website, who processes it? Who calls them to schedule the estimate, right? So like you want to learn every single process that goes through the whole, service chain and then match it with like who's actually doing it, right? Like that's the way you figure out what is the owner doing, what's going to go away after closing, and start to think through, okay, like what are the hires I might need to make or what do I need to pick up?
I'm curious because, you were willing to be flexible on sort of owner dependency.
Yeah.
Talk about that a little bit because, there are a lot of folks who are like, want to buy a business, but there has to be like a management team in place. And, people go into it being like, that's what I
Mhm.
want. Oftentimes that changes, obviously, when they see the deals out there. But
Correct.
how did you navigate that? And
Yeah, I mean the higher level point, which is exactly right that you're making, that like doing this is really hard, right? Like we have like I that's like the message I harp on all the time with searchers is like, hey, like you're gonna be in the weeds. Like even if you have a management team or like a GM, like you're 2 weeks notice away from being 100% in the business, right? Like so if you're not mentally prepared to be in the business full time, like you should not be signing a big personal guarantee, right? Like having some intentionality and just I'm a big believer in small business acquisition, obviously, but I want people to do it with their eyes wide open, right? And so for me, what it looked like was it was a father-son ownership group. They were the two crew leaders, like they were climbing trees 4 days a week,
oh, wow.
and they were the two salespeople. Um, and so it was like, okay, this is a big transition. So we basically had to come up with a transition plan where the dad stayed on for 3 months, which gave me time to we did an internal promotion on the crew side and then some time to hire a salesperson. And the son had agreed to stay on for 12 months and, which he really like put in the effort and worked hard, which I really appreciate. Which, that you sort of make a judgment call and like, do you trust the seller? And then at the end of his 12 months, then I was able to find a good replacement for both sales and crew. Um, and there's other stuff too, like the business ran out of the seller's home at the time. It was a home, I mean, and like it was functional as a home-based business, but if we want to grow it a lot, that's tough. So we signed like a 3-month lease basically to keep using the owner's home. And then during that time, I had to go find a commercial lease. So that was another transition moment. But the people is always the biggest part.
And how did you spend a lot of time with them during diligence? I don't know if site visit's the right word because obviously it was based out of their home, but
Yeah.
obviously a big part of this is just getting comfortable that the sellers are good people and they're going to help you through the transition. Like you said with the son who actually helped, because off even if you write it in the purchase agreement, it's just like
Yeah.
how did you really get comfortable with that transition?
No, I mean, so I did do a ride along with each of them, where they went on their sales day, right? So they are going and meeting with whatever, like 8 to 10 homeowners back to back on like a Saturday. I went and did one day with each of them doing that just to get a feel of like, okay, what is their style with clients? Like, how do the clients see them? And like my takeaway from that was both one, they're really good arborists, right? They give good arborist recommendations, but it's not necessarily like a cult of personality business, right? It's not like the clients are so in love with the specific people, right? They actually are just like they're good at building trust and they're giving good advice. And clients can feel that, right? So like to me, I was like, okay, like if I can hire people, arborists, right, who are ethical and high quality, and we can still deliver that kind of quality service. It's not like they just trust anything the seller says blindly because they just like him a lot. Like that would be hard to replace.
No, that's interesting. And how did you think about just like barriers to entry, competition, things like that?
Yeah, it's a relatively low barriers to entry industry. But if you think of landscaping, like residential landscaping being like the very lowest barriers to entry, like there's definitely a higher echelon here where like working at height requires a certain amount of skill and insurance and equipment. And so there's some real like brand value that have been built up, both the Google business profile and just some internal systems around like how do we actually operate every day. So I don't think there's like a new tree company could start with like a pickup truck, flat loading, and like that will always exist. But for the clients that we are trying to serve, like they want a certain level of professionalism, safety guarantees, and all of that. Like that, there is actually a bit of a barrier to entry that's built there.
That makes sense. And how long was the business running prior to you buying it?
It had been around for about 15 years. The owner was actually doing it as a second career. He came from a logging family originally. He was then an engineer at Boeing for a long time.
Wow,
And then when he left that, he decided to start a tree care business because it was sort of in his family background.
good for him. That's
Yeah.
awesome. What did the SBA process look like for you, by the way?
Yeah, so I mean, the SBA process is grueling, as I'm sure you know, but the original deal I did with Live Oak with Lisa Forrest, who's great, and they're like, I think the way I think of Live Oak is they're more conservative as lenders than a lot of banks, but if they're willing to do your deal, it's like a really smooth process in closing, all of that. And so for me, like they presented the lowest risk of not closing at the end, right? So that's why I went with Live Oak. And then it's just this like, I built like a lender deck the same way I built an investor deck and, marketed it to several banks who gave term sheets and, Live Oak was the one I selected. But then once you get into the commitment process and the closing process, it's just like whack-a-mole for like 30 days of like, okay, we need that document, we need that document. And you just have to keep up with it and try not to be the bottleneck.
And how long did it take from, I guess, signed LOI to close for you? Like, how long did
Yeah.
that
For the
period take?
original deal was 93 days.
Wow. That's
Uh,
really good. I know people often say 3 months is the average, but you rarely actually meet people who close in 3 months. So good for you.
yeah, I feel like we did a decent job. I mean, but yeah, we kind of, yeah, we kind of, I mean, look, that's the only thing I'm good at is closing the deals, right? Like before that, like my whole job was marching deals to the finish line. And that was with the Christmas holidays in between. Uh,
Wow.
and so that, yeah, the timing felt good. But Live Oak is also one of the most efficient lenders at closing as well. So that helps.
Agreed.
Yeah.
That's awesome. I'm curious what the first 90 days, 90 days to close. What did the first 90 days look like post transition? What did that look like? Like, what were you doing since obviously it was owner operated? So, what did you
Yeah.
immediately dive into?
Well, the challenge is with asset purchases, right? With which most of these small business deals are, there's a lot of logistics around just transferring accounts, like transferring payroll. Like the number one thing you can't screw up is payroll, right? So making sure payroll is ready for week one, then moving like the telephone from AT&T over to us, like that honestly took up the first like 2 to 3 weeks. It's just literal logistics, like getting QuickBooks set up. And then just trying to get as much face time with the team as you can, right? Like trying to show them who you are and make sure, we did a full team meeting where I introduced myself. And then
Did
my
any of the team members know about the sale prior, or how did they take it?
No, they didn't. They took it really well, thankfully.
Wow.
They were super gracious and welcoming me. And basically, the message I gave them was like, look, I'm not here to tell you how to climb trees, right? Like, that's not what I know. My job is to basically make sure your schedule is full, make sure the business operates well, and then we're going to try to grow. And when we try to grow, that means like new seats will open up for you if you want to grow as well. And like, that combination of like not changing and I'd gotten the advice which I stuck with, which is like no major changes for 90 days. I mean, even like the all the paychecks used to be handwritten by check, right? And like I kept doing that for 90 days before I changed to direct deposit. Uh,
Wow.
which was like a good learning because what I learned is the yard where our trucks are is a different spot than where the office is. And so you could go all week without seeing the crew until they come pick up their paycheck. And that's a moment to hang out, have a beer. So I was like, okay, like we're going to go to direct deposit, but I actually need to generate different touch points then. Otherwise, we're never going to see each other.
That's super interesting. I
Yeah.
guess with the home based business and
Yeah.
the yard
It's
being
just,
a separate
yeah,
location.
like a
Wow.
secondary impact of writing physical paychecks.
Huh. That's super interesting. And then I guess, well, what did the sort of the rest of I guess post 90 days, what did you decide, you were gonna first tackle? What did that look like?
The first major system change we made was moving the quoting process from handwritten to a, CRM. That was like we used to write like on physical forms with the, yellow version behind it that we would give the client. So we just needed to digitize that. I would say that's like one. And then two is starting to track KPIs, right? Like I had one of the things you'll see when you buy a new business is that the seller has a really good idea of like things are going well or not. They just have this gut sense for it because they've done it for so long. As a buyer, you have no idea, right? Like you cannot tell if things are going well or not. And so you just need to start tracking KPIs. And
What were some of the specific KPIs you were tracking?
yeah, so for me was basically how many estimates were we giving each week? How many projects, were closed each week? What was our revenue for each week? And what was our crew payroll hours for each week? Because that like labor rate in this type of business is kind of the best measure of like productivity. Um, and so if I track that weekly, and I was able to go backwards and kind of count it for some historical period as well. Like literally, I was just on Google Calendar counting by hand, like the number of estimates given. And same thing to count the number of jobs booked. The only way I could do that was went to the sent emails in the inbox, and I just filtered by like booking email, like the template, and I would just like literally count those emails. So those two, like I started to track data that would start to give me a baseline of like what is good, what is bad. And then we started to move over to a digital system so that we could actually like the data would start to self-populate.
That's interesting. Did you find that as you switch from handwritten to CRM that you were actually, closing more deals or that rate increase or you could handle more jobs or was it just better, easier to track for you guys?
Yeah, it was more just easier to track, right? The former sellers are the best salespeople, right? They're always going to because they're the owners. That's just the nature of it. The challenge was honestly like they were really good at sort of putting in little notes in the handwritten version that like it's hard to quite capture those notes in a typed up version. And so honestly, more of what we had was it was more confusing for the crew when they would get the work orders. And so we had to figure out how do we make the communication really clean.
Mm.
But eventually, I think the closing rate did get helped a lot by the fact that we could have automated reminders and stuff like that. So I think the closing rate would have gone down more when we went from owner sellers to employee sellers. So we were able to offset that by having better follow-up sequences and stuff like that.
I'm curious, you mentioned the closing rate decrease. I mean, was that sort of expected? Did you kind of model that into your assumptions? And at what point did you guys actually, or did you actually start bringing on new hires? So you
Right.
obviously knew that you needed to replace the owner and
Yeah.
his son at some point. So when did you start sort of making that a priority?
Yeah, I would say that I started working on around like 6 months in, like 6 months ahead of the son leaving, because we were chatting the whole time and making sure we were on the same page. I think the learning for me was it's not so much the closing rate that was the impact, it was the number of leads the sellers could process in a day is way higher than most salespeople, right? And so like the two sellers, they would basically crew lead all day and then they'd go to do 2 to 3 leads that afternoon. They do that Monday through Thursday, and then they both do a full day on Saturday.
Wow.
Um, and like or yeah, full day Friday, full day Saturday. And so like what felt like I needed like it on paper, it looks like 40 hours a week of sales work. In practice, it was really more I needed 2 salespeople,
Right.
right? To pick up all of that. That's hard to figure out in advance. And so that's where like I made the hire. So I mean, let me clarify. It's more like I needed 1.5 people. So I pretty quickly had to make the second hire. So I got the new capacity, but also like you take the cost of the full person up front until you can grow into it.
Right. It's interesting. What were you primarily focused on at this point?
Mostly just keeping the trains running on time, right? Like I would show up every morning at 6:45 a.m., do the like open up the shop, get make sure the work orders were looking good and passing them out. Like most of the issues in the business would arise between 7 a.m. and like 8:30 a.m. because somebody calls out or a truck breaks down or the guys get to a job site and there's an issue. And so then after 8:30 or 9 a.m., that's when I could like start my actual work, so to speak. And then that was just like it's just a slow process of like 1% improvements wherever you can fit them in while just trying to keep up with all of like I did all the bookkeeping for the first 2 years. I still do all the sales tax and like licensing compliance and all of that. And sales and marketing, obviously. So all of that, I just sort of like did my best.
Wow. And obviously, especially the first year, you're trying to learn everything, you're trying to manage everything at the same time. I guess, how did that compare to your job in private equity? You're looking for more better work-life balance, maybe.
Yeah.
How did it end up comparing?
Yeah, I would say the first year was definitely like not better work-life balance, right? What's different is like you have more choice over what time you're using to do what. Like I'm not answering to anyone in particular. But my like what I've generally seen, and this is still true today, like I work much fewer hours than I did in PE, but any given week is like I'm still more tired, right? Like the amount of stuff you're holding in your head and the decision, like the constant flow of decisions that's a little bit more tiring. Whereas at least in PE, it was a little bit simpler in that like they would just like point me in a direction. I'd just go, right? Like I was good at that. This is a lot more of like low conviction decisions that are maybe can go a lot of different directions and they keep changing every day, a lot of firefighting. So that's I think like where I'm both like the first year was obviously the hardest, but even like my second year, it was still like, it was probably only like 50-ish hours a week of work. It's not that bad in terms of hours, but it's just like it's on your mind always.
Yeah, entrepreneurship, gotta love
Yeah,
it.
exactly. Right.
I'm curious with that, like in that first year, I mean, what you made the Tuck-in acquisitions year two, is that correct?
No, my in year three.
Year three. At what point were you like, I know I want to continue growing this thing? Like, did you always go in thinking this was maybe going to be like a role play? Were you looking to, exit at a higher multiple? Like, what was the
Yeah.
plan? Or was it just cash flow for you? Did you not have a plan?
Yeah, no, the initial plan was this is how I expressed it to my investors at the time. I said, look, like I'm going to take 2 years to figure out what's going on here. And at that point, I think one of three things will become clear, and they're not mutually exclusive. But one is like we really like this business and industry, and we think we can do a lot of organic growth. And so we're just going to double down and try to grow it. Two is like we really like this industry. We can't like I haven't cracked the code on organic growth, but I think there's inorganic growth. Like we can go do acquisitions. And it could be a combo of one and two. And three is, hey, like well, this is tough, right? Like we're not quite figuring it out. And like I need to just focus on running a really smooth business, not focus on growth and slowly pay down debt. Um, and basically, like I got to the end of 2 years and I was like, okay, like I've done some organic growth, but it's hard. And I'm better as at acquisitions. So I don't want to do a roll up per se, where I'm just like sort of aggregating revenue. But if I can find really good small businesses that are adjacent to us, either in service area or just local competitors that are, that where I respect them in terms of their like tree work and their ownership, like it just makes it's a lot easier to grow one full crew at a time than it is to grow like 10% of a crew at a time, right? And so that was what the first acquisition last year was, is that allowed us to bring in a full crew and the client base to support a full crew. And so that's sort of how we moved from 2 crews to 3 crews. And that was like kind of quite meaningful. So like right now we run 3 crews full time, and I want to get us to like 5 crews because that's where this business will really hum. Um, and so that could be a mix of organic and inorganic growth.
I guess speaking of organic growth,
Yeah.
what worked those first 2 years? And, were you able to grow the business quite a bit? Like, what did that actually look like?
Yeah, we were able to grow revenue, but not nearly as much as we added cost, right, to the business. So that's a J curve, which is normal and okay. But I mean, the business, like new lead generation side is almost entirely digital, right? So it's like Google Ads and SEO. And I think the mistake I made for the first year and a half was I sort of just offloaded all of that. Like I outsourced it and I was sort of like, I don't understand this. I'm going to put my head in the box or in the sand. Over the last year and a half, I realized, hey, like this needs to be a core competency, actually. This is like how we generate lead flow. So I've taken over much more direct management of it. And only now I feel like I understand it well enough to again outsource it. And now I can actually hold agencies accountable. So that part is like the lead flow side. Um, the existing client base, it was more of a like activation thing, right? Like how often do we email them? How often do we remind them we exist? Because a lot of them, they don't need us for like 3 years, right? So you kind of want to like find a cadence to reach out. The goal is eventually to have personalized reminders, right? Like when your dentist sends you like a reminder. We're not there yet. But at least like even getting like a newsletter, at a certain cadence going out. And we sort of like segregate or not segregated, what's the word? We batched out our email list across like 7 different groups so that I could send one at a time. So it'd be the same newsletter, but it'd go out across 7 weeks, right? So
Right.
that way, like the leads are also kind of dispersed. So yeah.
No, that makes sense. And I guess as you're looking for these tuck-ins, what was that like? Were you? It's very different. I think a lot of people don't recognize like the first acquisition. I think is takes a lot longer. I mean, I'm curious in your case, but just as a completely different experience than when you're trying to bring tuck-ins into your portfolio. But what did that look like for you?
Yeah, I mean, the first add-on we did was like that business required like it was a larger deal. So it was still smaller than my original deal, but it required doing like a full refinancing of my SBA loan in order to finance it. So as a result, that actually took longer because that refinancing process is kind of complex and like required again going out to a bunch of banks to see who wants to do it. Whereas the second tuck-in I did was just sort of cash and seller note and much smaller. And it's like that one, I think like LOI to closing was like, I forget, it was like 40 days or something, right? And it's just much, much easier to underwrite that because like you had that, like by the time you're doing your second tuck-in, you're like, okay, these are the three things I need answered. Like this will tell me what is the right value for this. Like it's just not as complex.
Did you use an expansion, like an SBA expansion loan for the first tuck-in, or
No, I ended up doing a full refi with the new SBA lender. Because the benefit of that is your existing loan, right, which had 8 years left on it, it stretches back out to 10 years. So your payment profile gets a lot better if you do that.
and when you how are you finding the tuck-ins? Were they, I mean, these add-ons, were they like other home service sort of business owners you'd met through the process? Were you actively looking on listing sites and meeting with brokers? What did that look like?
Yeah, I mean, I was still actively looking on the listing sites and talking to brokers. Both of the deals had a broker. But like the first one, I had met that owner now through the industry association. So there's a little bit more like pre-built trust that like, hey, I'm like a real person. Like I'm not like a total rando. And so it just made it a lot easier. Like I think from like when it was listed to us being under LOI was like a week or two, right? It was just like we were like the obvious buyer. They had a reasonable asking price, so I met their ask. Like all of that just works more smoothly than when you're a searcher. And then the second deal, the broker reached out to me about that one because like at this point, like I told basically all the brokers I can try to tell like, hey, like I'm open if you guys find good tree trimming businesses for sale. And so you start to build a bit of a local brand.
Were they both tree trimming businesses?
Mhm.
Very similar to the original?
Yeah, the first one more so. That one's actually even more. It's like 80-ish% tree trimming. And in fact, like we'd worked with them before because like they didn't do a lot of big storm type work, like storm removal. So they would actually refer their clients to us for some of that. So we had like like a competitive respect type of relationship. The second one I did, we didn't know them as well, and they're probably more like 50-50. But they help us expand our service area a little bit more. And so that was why that one made sense.
And how's it been sort of integrating those two businesses? 2 in 1 year is a lot,
Yeah.
especially when you're
The
still.
second one was easier because in that case it was really just a husband-wife ownership group, so we didn't end up bringing on any employees. It was really just a client-based acquisition. The first one was a lot of work. Yeah, the integration was intense. Like we had to make a lot of transitions around like their crew worked 4 10-hour days, our crew worked 5 8-hour days. So like we had to like, get that aligned. They had a different yard than us. Like we eventually had to combine the dispatch to one yard. Um, so that took like 90 days of transition at least. And those are pretty intense work periods.
How much were you able to grow the business through those add-ons compared to organically?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit hard to quite parse. But I would say the add-ons are probably like 2/3 of our growth, and organic's probably 1/3 of our growth so far. Uh, Roughly. I don't know. It's like, I don't, my data's not that good yet either, which is a bummer. We're working on it.
And now that you're kind of through that integration phase, how do you feel about making additional add-on acquisitions in the
Yeah,
coming
I mean, the
years?
best the best part of that first acquisition is we got some really good people, right? Like it is hard to find really good people like that. Like those guys would not have just like applied to a job posting that I put up, right? And so for me, more and more, I'm thinking of like both we want to acquire a high quality client base, but also like who is on the team, right? Like that is going to be, we will be people constrained as we grow. And so if we can unlock the people constraint through acquisition, like that's really effective.
And now that you're a couple years in, how is the I guess your original plan was like, let's see kind of where this goes, three different
Yeah.
directions. Where do you stand now in terms of like how long you're going to run this business, maybe sell
Yeah.
one day, maybe just run for cash flow? Like where do you stand there?
Yeah, I mean, right now I'm pretty focused on like how do we build just an enduring tree care business, right? And so to me, that means like we need to have 5 crews, like that's the right size for one location, basically. And so like I'm kind of in it until we get there. At the same time, like my personal work time is still it's getting a little bit more released as the operations manager takes on more and more. So I've also spent more time on my own like content and writing and investing and all that. I want it to be a healthy mix of all of it. But at least with the business for now, my focus is how do we build this business to get to the a slightly larger size.
Makes sense. What were some of the most sort of impactful decisions you've made? It sounds like in the pre-call we kind of spoke about the operations manager, but tell us a little bit more about that and how that's maybe changed your life and maybe some of
Mm.
the other decisions that have been very impactful in a positive way.
Yeah, I mean the first acquisition last year was really the catalyst where like it didn't like we added like 50% capacity, but it like increased complexity by like 200%, right? Which I didn't fully anticipate. And so that's really when it became clear. I was like, okay, like these operations are a little bit too much for me to now manage myself and do the rest. And so it really, like, even the seller of that business, she was like, "Look, it's time," which or I think I told her, I was like, "I think I know I need to do this," and she was like, "Yeah, I'm glad you said it." And so and I feel really good about the hire we made, and that like she has prior experience in the industry, which is pretty hard to find.
How
Uh,
did you, a lot of people want to find that ops manager, that GM, or whatever that role may be, but in the industry. But how did you go about finding yours? And what is her role? What did she actually replace?
Yeah. I mean she applied on Indeed, which is
Love it.
wild. That like I mean Indeed works. So,
It does.
but
It does. It really does.
yeah. But I was also doing a lot of like networking and pushing it out because I've now built out a community in the arborist world and I was sending them the job posting being like, hey, like who do you know? Who do you think could do this? So I think I was sort of doing a all hands on deck hiring push. And so I talked to a couple other really good candidates too. So I felt good about the hiring process. In terms of the actual role, the way I organized the role is more outputs oriented, like what outputs are they accountable for? And so the 4 outputs that role is accountable for is maintaining a productive and satisfied employee base, maintaining of operational equipment and fleet, maintaining a satisfied client base, and then lastly, basically maintaining operational smoothness. And then the two that really stayed with me are like basically everything around revenue management and growth, like sales and marketing and acquisitions, and then also just like core admin, like business ownership stuff, like taxes and compliance and licensing and all of that and insurance.
How has that impacted sort of hours you've been working in the business?
I mean, well, honestly, the hours aren't that different. I just said now I'm spending them on stuff I really feel like I'm better at now.
Yeah,
Um, a big thing for me was letting go of morning dispatch, right? Like if I'm not the first call during morning dispatch, it suddenly gives me back like brain space to like spend the morning actually like trying to build the business. Um, so yeah, like the sales team still reports to me. And so it's like a lot of it's been sort of just now I do one-on-ones with the sales team. I do one-on-ones with the ops manager, like and our tree healthcare operations folk. And so like that I feel like I'm more of like a real like business leader now, right? Whereas before I was sort of like a glorified GM. Now it's like I actually have a little bit of like I can set priorities and work on them.
got it. No, interesting. I'm curious, I know we're at time, but if you have
I
One
can go,
more.
yeah, I can go to like 5 minutes past, I think. Yeah. And then
Okay,
I,
cool.
yeah.
Last question is
Yes.
completely unrelated, but you mentioned you are backing some of these self-funded searchers, doing similar things to what you are. What are you looking for as an
Mm,
investor?
yeah. I think the number, I've thought about this a lot actually. And I think like one of the primary things I'm looking for is somebody that's just ready to get in the weeds, right? Like they have a mentality that they are the backstop of this business. They're gonna be the true owner. Um, like somebody who's not going to make excuses basically, right, for when things don't go well. Because ultimately it just is the small business owners. And the way I think about it is like the small business journey is a total roller coaster, right? But your job as the business owner is to deliver a pretty smooth experience to your W-2 employees, right? Like that's the trade, is like you get the equity upside, but then they get a smooth life, right? And so it's like it is part of your role as the business owner, like you are getting that equity upside because you're also feeling the downside, right? And so like if the
Correct.
person does, if I don't feel like they've really grasped that and are being really intentional about why they're getting into this, like if they're viewing it as a like, hey, this really makes sense on paper as good math, like the math always works when you underwrite these deals, right? If you buy them below 5 times and put a ton of debt on, like yeah, it works. It's really like the practicality, like does the searcher actually understand what they're getting into?
No, that's great advice for those listening who, maybe want to raise investor capital. Because I definitely, I'm sure you do too, like get a lot of folks who are like, yeah, I'm planning to be, semi-absentee, or which is definitely a red flag for me as someone who invests in these deals. Um,
That's the big one. Yeah. I mean, the outside of that, I feel like there's not a single like type of searcher or background of searcher that can or can't be, successful at this. I think it's primarily like, are they ownership oriented, right? And do they kind of like take that responsibility?
no, that makes a lot of sense. Well, look, I don't want to take up too much more of your time, Costa, but any sort of final words of wisdom for, those out there that are maybe um few years behind where you are
Yeah.
right now.
I think the primary point that I'm trying to raise with searchers these days when I talk to them is like, hey, like, are you sure you want to do this and why? Like trying to like set up the why as much as you can before you buy a small business, because you're going to need that to sustain you while it's difficult. And obviously the why can mature and evolve over time. That's just natural. But I think for me, I really want to express that this is like a big undertaking. And not to take it lightly just because like it pencils on paper.
100% agreed. Well, Costa, really, really appreciate your time today. If people want to reach out, by the way, give us the name of your newsletters, folks
Yep.
can follow, as well as, where's the best place to find you.
Yeah, I mean, so I write a Substack called Big Deal Small Business. So you can find that that's the starting spot where a lot of my thoughts are better there than when I talk about them because I've actually sat down and written them. But also they can find me on LinkedIn and I'm on Twitter as well. So Twitter DMs is usually the easiest if you want to connect directly. But I'll usually redirect you first to the Substack because most of the questions are answered there. But then I'm happy to chat if there's more, like in-depth stuff that we need to get into.
Sounds good. Well, really appreciate it again, and enjoy, I guess, Friday afternoon. So enjoy the rest of your day and your weekend. And I'm
Awesome.
looking forward
Thanks
to
so
staying
much.
in touch.
Enjoy the rest of your trip, Helen. Thanks for having me.